So we wanted to start with some ideas from earlier projects that are still at play in our current work. This project, Arrange Life, was a competition entry for a house in Los Angeles. And you can see Meredith and I are here standing in front of the elevation of the house. And in this project, material qualities show up in a few different ways. So for example, rocks show up as profile. So you can see here the edge of this exterior wall, image printed on the facade, and form. Next slide. This separation between image and form is something that we've been working on really since the beginning of our practice. And the origins of this are in hybrid forms of representation that arose when we needed to merge one-to-one material prototypes. You can see some of those floating around us here with speculative design projects. And so photogrammetry is just one example of a tool that we often used to digitally process material tests and produce separate files for image, which would give us a texture map, and 3D form, which would give us the mesh model. Next. So here's the roof plan for this project. And you can see how the image of rock kind of shapes and profiles of rock and actual rocks merge to enclose a series of inhabitable spaces that accommodate living. Next.
Another ongoing interest of teams is the scenographic, which for us is really about placing images in space, images that you can inhabit, kind of like we are right now. This can be seen in the billboard quality of the facade of this house behind us, which is meant to kind of resonate with the Hollywood sign, a kind of flat sign that is just beyond the site. In this project, which is called A Living Picture, this is from 2017, we're imaging borrowed scenography. So we recreated as a digital model a historic outdoor theater. And then we used that digital model to create images that we then placed in space by kind of constructing that rendering as three-dimensional physical objects that people could move through and around and inhabit. Next. So here we are in the interior of that same house, the house with the kind of billboard-like exterior that kind of mimicked the texture and materiality and form of rock in different ways. So on the inside of that house, you can kind of see the structure that sets up that scenographic backdrop to the outside. On the interior, architectural surfaces are also understood to be a kind of backdrop for life. We're trying to kind of set a scene that has the possibility to change and accommodate different activities. Next, please. So this is the plan where we can again see the interior organization of the house. I think what's important to point out here is that instead of rooms, we were really thinking about a kind of loose staging of domestic activities. So instead of a kind of fixed relationship between a space that has a specific designation for a program, we started placing a range of objects, furniture, surfaces, which you can see a little bit in the plan, and of course, the kind of backdrops that set the stage for life. Next, please. So an example of that is here on the outside. Behind us, you can see what could be thought of as a kitchen, but maybe a better way to think of it is a kind of loose accumulation of the objects and tools that you would use for cooking. So this is one way in which there are different modes of inhabitation and living that can kind of unfold over time. Next.
So this project is called Additional Address from 2018. And here we're continuing to think about domestic interiors. So this project is a design for an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit. So a much more modest scale of living space than the previous one. Next. And so here we spatialized images to increase the sense of scale. So as I mentioned, it's a quite modest space, and we use images to kind of expand that space and address the close quarters of the primary residence on the site. And we were once again kind of thinking about an active scenography that would reveal its construction. So in this isometric study, you can see how the house unfolds around this kind of vertical totem in the middle, which is a storage space below and a closet or another kind of storage space above, and with exposed substructure and layered construction. Next. And here in another isometric study, you can see how we use image to pull the landscape into the interior, producing an artificial horizon that extends the space and makes it feel bigger than it is. Next, please. So in this project, the idea of materializing images began to merge for us with an interest in cheap building materials. And we started kind of around the office calling this the Menards Theory. So Menards is a local Midwestern-based big box hardware store where you can find like a myriad of products printed with the image of building materials, often rock or stone, but also other kinds of materials. And for us, there was this kind of latent aesthetic project in these commercial building products, and you know, a kind of humor, but also like an earnestness in the way which they were kind of trying hard to look like something else, but you know, not that hard. Next, please.
So the previous scene that we were just in was a design for an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit that started out as a kind of speculative project. And here we're standing in the built version of that project that kind of evolved as it became more real. So the reality of construction, of course, introduces new design considerations, but we really wanted to continue this dual interest in affordable construction and the possibility that that can produce images, that there's a kind of image of materiality that becomes the image of the project. Next, please. So given that the ADU shares a site with an existing house, and because of the local zoning code, it actually had to be physically attached to the existing residence. So this means that the massing has to negotiate this necessity of connection and kind of sharing an address, while also producing a separate identity and a kind of face for that unit. So you can see right here beside me, there's an entrance along the kind of side of the house. And there's large windows that are kind of oriented to the back, which is a nice wooded area. And there's a way in which the massing kind of scoots its way to the rear of the site and leaves the existing site, or the existing residence has views and access to the woods in their backyard as well. Next. So here is the ADU under construction. And I think what we wanted to point out is that, of course, this is a site-specific project, but for us, it's also been a prototype with which we can kind of experiment with affordable construction. Here we're using SIPs. This is one factory-based method of construction that we're using to kind of shorten the amount of on-site labor. Next slide. And here you can see another strategy that we're using to kind of minimize the time for on-site work, which is an insulated slab on grade foundation. And what this does is it minimizes the amount of excavation. There's not a need for what's called a Michigan basement, which is what's typically used around here. And it reduces the waste as well of traditional formwork. Next.
On the outside of the ADU, there are a series of material planes that wrap volumes and slip over and past one another. There are three types of cladding. So there's a metal roof, which wraps down and kind of folds around, the kind of capping the volumes. The SIPs themselves are coated in a liquid applied vapor barrier and then wrapped primarily or partially in a stainless steel metal mesh, or when not the metal mesh, an open joint panel. And in terms of image, the focus for us shifted away from images of nature that we had been working with in previous projects, so images of rocks or plants, to images of building materials like OSB or concrete. So when possible, we use the construction system to produce the finished surface on the interior, and then use kind of image of that material to produce surfaces in other portions of the project. So for example, you can see Meredith standing on the concrete floor, which because it's a slab on grade produces the finished surface. And if we go to the next slide, we can see how in the interior, the texture of OSB and the very similar texture of LSL columns and joints show up on the interior to produce walls, ceilings, and the stair to the second floor bedroom mezzanine. And so the project is currently under construction, as Meredith pointed out. So some of these surfaces will get covered up, but many of them will remain exposed. Next, please.
So this thinking about ways to make construction more affordable is something that can have impact at a much larger scale than a single ADU. Especially when it comes to the desire to kind of diversify housing options and making well-designed homes that are more attainable to more people. This is something that we've been thinking about in a current project that is very much a work in progress, but we wanted to share at least a few images from that for you. This is a current project in Detroit. And in this project, we're working systematically to produce a number of multifamily types that range from as small as a duplex to as large as around 16 units, and different buildings that are on different sites in the same neighborhood. And all of them are deriving from the same logics of the construction systems that we've selected to, again, try to bring down costs, which are very high in Detroit right now, but at the same time deliver a good home for people. So some of the systems that we're using are the same insulated slab on grade foundation, like the one that I'm standing on right now. We're using a different prefabricated composite panel wall and roof system, and we'll kind of explain why this opens up all kinds of opportunities for the design. And similar to the ADU that we're standing in right now, there's this idea that we can use building systems that can double as the finish. So rather than layering on additional material that adds additional cost, can we aestheticize the materials that we're using to kind of create the building and to create these the exterior walls. Next.
So as Meredith pointed out, the prefabricated wall and roof panel that we're using is both an affordable construction system, but also opened up some other kind of design opportunities for the project. So because it's so affordable and it's also incredibly well insulated, we can create more exterior surface area than you would typically find in low budget construction. And what that means is that we're able to kind of break down the massing from being one block to being a series of smaller masses and produce an exterior circulation for the project. So you get kind of smaller footprint loft units on the second story up above, which are stacked on top of larger footprint garden units. And the circulation, which produces a kind of elevated circulation and outdoor patio for all of the loft units. And it's, maybe wasn't intentionally designed into the project, but turns out to be like a very pandemic friendly building because there's no shared surfaces that you have to touch in order to get to your unit. There are no doorknobs or interior hallways. So there was this kind of convergence, let's say, of a desire for affordability with also a desire for sustainability and the production of a nice place to live. So things like ventilation and daylighting contribute to all of those ambitions. And also the buildings are electrified, so there's no, fully electrified, so there's no natural gas coming to these. And so something like that keeps operation costs and utility bills low for tenants, but also helps meet some of the sustainability goals for the project. Next, please.
And so this project that we're talking about, it's you know, again, a work in progress. And I think the way that we've been thinking about affordability in this case is that the idea is not to reduce architecture to a minimum product of housing, but really about finding these trade-offs and these kinds of opportunities in the systems that we're using to sort of redistribute the budget so that we can place value where it matters for a better quality of living. And so it's been a kind of interesting conversation within our office and with the larger team about where those priorities lie. Next. And so you can kind of see a little bit of what I mean in this exterior rendering where we're standing outside of one of the larger buildings. I believe this is a 16-unit building where there's open space on the ground that connects to an elevated kind of shared patio space above. So again, that ability to create more exterior walls than you might normally in a kind of budget conscious project. And that sort of creates a connection between the ground floor and the upper units and kind of creates that sense of community. Next. Here we are on that second level, so up those stairs and in what we're calling the elevated street. So there are the rest of the entrances that are not on the ground floor all kind of converge on this street. There's a couple units that are on the third floor, but their doors are also here and they have a stoop before kind of going up to their individual units. Next.
So these buildings that we've been working on are kind of prototype buildings for a larger development that will incorporate the different types that we were showing. So everything from a duplex currently up to 16-unit and mixed-use buildings. And one of the ambitions of the project is to work kind of higher density into single-family neighborhoods. And in a dispersed city like Detroit that really was designed and evolved around the automobile, creating this density requires pushing back on current zoning restrictions or kind of finding ways to work around them because those zoning restrictions overwhelmingly privilege single family housing. So things like minimum lot sizes, which are really big, or minimum parking requirements, which are too stringent, or setbacks, which are too large. So those, you know, things like that, which are, say, counter to the ambition of producing like a dense, walkable urban neighborhood. And so a lot of this project for us has been about figuring out how to work around those current zoning restrictions.
So what Ellie is describing suggests to us that there's a need for new housing types. And, you know, this is a project that many people are working on. And something that we're really excited to be working on with this larger team. You may have heard this term missing middle. This has emerged as a kind of approach to deal with some of those restrictions that Ellie mentioned in order to insert a denser housing into single family zoned areas. So missing middle is meant to be this kind of middle between the scale of the single family house and the scale of a high-rise apartment building. This probably isn't an issue in Manhattan, where many of you are, but in a lot of the country, zoning has been a huge hurdle. I think something like 75% of residential land is zoned for single family detached housing. So there's a kind of history here too of municipalities using zoning to limit access to housing. And so there are a lot of issues that are layered here. So the missing middle for us is a kind of model. It's one way to try to reverse this trend. But I think for us, there's some aesthetic limitations to a lot of the projects that come out of that thinking. They're often attempting to kind of simulate the traditional look of single-family housings and to kind of hide and fit into that context. I think we're excited about the possibility of looking forward and thinking about new types that can incorporate a range of units and provide housing at below market rate rents. Next. So in a much more speculative way, a kind of older project, I think this is from 2017, it's called Ghost Box. It's also trying to reimagine a building type that has been very persistent in the way it's shaped the American landscape. So we're standing outside of a big box that in a speculative way, team imagined a kind of re-inhabitation with different programs through a process of reassembly. So again, we're dealing with a type that has kind of become obsolescent under changing economic circumstances. Next, please. So the big box retail store is very familiar to all of us, and it is this kind of spatial format that comes out of a certain model of business. But for us, there's also a really interesting material specificity to its construction, and that's something we wanted to kind of draw from in this proposal. So here we're selectively disassembling the existing big box store and then reassembling the parts to kind of break down what it's currently kind of designed to do efficiently and to create the possibility of other kinds of occupations. Next.
This project, which is called Detroit Reassembly Plant from 2016-2017, took on a really large factory building in Detroit, the Packard automobile plant, which was a building of reinforced concrete and brick. So similar to the big box, a building type that represents a kind of failing typology which remains embedded in the city as a ruin. And so the project proposed redistributing the physical matter to create alternate uses and a new image of that disused materiality. So we were trying to shift from ruin to, or kind of perceived ruin, and the liability, let's say, which comes along with that perception of blight, to an active site of collecting, sorting waste material, and casting new material out of that waste. Next, please. And this project, Ghost Box, that Meredith was describing, was an homage, sorry, to Site, and some of their projects from the 1970s and 80s. So this project was commissioned for the 2017 Chicago Biennial and was our kind of response to a provocation that asked us about a contemporary relationship to history. And so, of course, we're appropriating Site's signage here with our practice name. And it's, of course, a little bit cheeky, but it also, the project in general was a real test for design ideas that we're continuing to work on and that we're currently starting to explore in a new project. Next, please. So for this project, which is also in Detroit, we were asked to renovate an old commercial space. So it's this building that you can see behind Meredith and me for new retail and a community-based organization and nonprofit. So this is the way that the building looks today. The one important piece of it that's missing is a large billboard, which used to be mounted above it and was removed by the advertising company that owned it. And the building is currently not used. It's disused, and its facade has become a kind of canvas for art. Next, please.
So in our proposal, rather than rebuild the roof, which is caving in, rather than rebuilding the interiors exactly as they were before, we're proposing to insert a new building into the shell of the old building. So we're kind of shifting the interior a little bit to the right in this elevation in front of you in order to kind of open up space on the left. And so there is this very explicit distinction between the old and the new, which in a way helps kind of reframe or represent the qualities of the existing building that are nice, such as the brick detailing and these big framed openings, which we kind of mimic in the new building. Next. So here you can also see one of the results of that move of inserting a new building within the shell of the old building. By kind of pushing it over to the side, we're opening up this courtyard space, which has several functions that can kind of overlap. Next slide. And here you can start to see how the design is progressing, where there are these overlapping activities that are centered here in the courtyard, from basketball to eating food that comes from the walk-up food service that's behind and under the billboard, which is now a kind of reinstalled as this occupiable space that comes off of the second story of the retail and nonprofit behind it. Next slide.
So the idea here is that subtraction can yield new possibilities for the building, which so we're comparing this maybe idea to the open air civic space that was produced in the Ghost Box project previously, and thinking about ways that we can carry forward those ideas into this new project. Next, please. So we're now back in the Ghost Box model, but we're now on the other side of the model, which reveals the interior. So to inhabit the inside of a retail building, which was designed for a certain model of efficiency, we inserted scenographic elements that help recode and reframe what's left behind after the partial disassembly. So you can see behind us these large wall scale scenographic backdrops printed with image of ground and sky. Or on this side, also walls printed with images which kind of evoke mountainous or rock-like qualities, but are actually large-scale photographs of physical material tests that we did in the office. So the printed imagery hanging establishes a new horizon that extends and kind of reconfigures the space of the interior. And the profiled walls, which have this kind of mountainous type quality, create visual layers that break down the interior into smaller scales. Next. Where'd you go, Meredith?
I'm right here.
Hey.
In place of efficiency, we're trying to introduce some variation and change. So again, there's this layering from many points of view within the project, both high and low. And the kind of layering of these scenographic elements do not produce a kind of single vantage point or a single possibility for the kinds of activities that can happen there, but it's really meant to be somewhat open-ended, that the layers can kind of change out over time, and that new scenes could take shape. So this idea of reassembly that's really been a kind of ongoing sort of strategy that our practice has been experimenting with is tied to the visual in that sense. Next, please. Oh, thanks. But reassembly is also tied to our interest in material reuse. So here you see some kind of early prototypes that came from the Detroit Reassembly Plant design process, where we were literally recombining fragments of brick, fragments of concrete with waste plastic, and mixing them up in a way that were still kind of rough, that still retained the identity of those materials and kind of produced interesting textures and color combinations that, while they were identifiable and could be kind of connected to their previous use as building materials, as plastic containers, they also started to kind of produce a new image. and that's something that Reassembly has also meant for us. Next slide. So in a more full-scale prototype called Plastic Order, which is this column over here, we again combined waste plastics with building materials. So concrete, brick, glass, some of these things that are pictured up here. In this case, we were really explicitly interested in the physical byproducts of demolition and construction, and that these could be reconstituted and recombined, in this case, in this monolithically cast column. Next. And I think at a different scale, the models that we have built kind of operate as small constructions. They become sites for material experimentation, you know, again, at scale. So we're able to test a little bit an idea about tectonics. What does it mean to repurpose the smallest fragment of something to a large chunk of a building? But also it allows us to test the aesthetics of this reassembly process. Next.
So this project is called Models on View. It's an exhibition that we designed for the gallery at the architecture school at Kent State in Ohio in 2019. And our original plan when we were asked to do an exhibition for this gallery was to display some of our recent models. So the Ghost Box model that we were just in, the model for Detroit Reassembly Plant. And as we were working on the project, we found out that the door, which is right here behind me, is narrower than the model's smallest dimension. So there was no way to get them into the gallery. And so we needed a new plan. So next. So what we did was we built a series of large-scale dioramas of our projects to create scenes, which were intended to be viewed from outside the gallery. So they were staged in various ways. Some of them appeared like quote unquote models in crates or the image of crates. Some appeared as images on monitors. Of course, they were just backlit pieces of vellum. And some were these dioramic scenographic models. Next, please. And I think an important part of this exhibition was that instead of maintaining this illusion, because we didn't allow anyone to have physical access to the gallery, but we chose to reveal visually the apparatus behind the image making. So you can see here in these images, the way in which the softbox lights and the props, which are holding up blankets printed with images from our physical model, were revealed as you got close to the gallery window and peeked inside. And for us, this, let's say, kind of ethos or value of eschewing some kind of perfect view in preference for multiple views is something that is really important to us. And we were interested in this almost kind of perverse mediation of our own work through representing images and representing materials that had themselves originally already been representations and images of materials in their first instantiations. Next, please.
Yeah, so we thought that this would be a good place to end, that this exhibition kind of represented a way in which we can kind of pull back the curtain and peel back the many layers of imagery, the multiple streams of information that create our impressions of reality. So beyond the specifics of this exhibition, right here, it suggests a kind of way of seeing, and it's a way of seeing that we think is of utmost importance right now, where we find ourselves.